Hey everybody, so recently I went to an art museum, and there were some thoughts that I had while I was there that I wanted to get out there, that I thought were worth talking about. So there were a couple different exhibits. This is a pretty big gallery. I'm not going to say, which one or where or any of the details because I don't want to dox myself. But basically, it's a pretty big museum. There are a lot of different exhibits, a lot of different types of works on display. But as I was meandering through the galleries, I found two that were in pretty close proximity to each other that really struck my interest in particular and that I want to address. So the first one is an exhibit that included a lot of works by modernist artists, or artists who were proponents of modernism or who were expressing modernism through their work. So this would be a lot of things from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s primarily. It would be like cars, like there's a physical car in the exhibit. There were like things like toasters and like mirrors and lamp shades and things like that were just of that era. And it was very much like a consumeristic kind of a product-based era. If you know like the kind of art style of like Fallout or the original BioShock, it's that kind of a look, like that 1950s and 60s aesthetic that people had back then, with the kind of hard lines and the sloping, gentle curves that made everything like all the cars sort of looked like airplanes. They had wings on the back, tail fenders, and so forth. And while I don't agree with everything that the modernist philosophy espoused, I do have a particular appreciation for their style of artwork. It's sort of nostalgic, even though I've never even lived in that time period. I was born in the 90s. But it's something that you can sort of indirectly appreciate, even though you haven't lived through that time period, right? But I think that I was going to talk about two art galleries. It's really three. It's the two and then the one in between. It sort of demonstrates a natural progression. I'm sure that the museum was probably organized in that way, although there were other exhibits and other placements that would probably disprove that statement. But anyway, after the modernist exhibit, there was this postmodernist exhibit. So if you're unfamiliar with modernism or postmodernism, I'm not going to get super deep into it, so don't worry if you're, turned off by like deep philosophical discussion. I'm not going to do that here, so don't worry about it. But just touching on it on a very surface level, modernism is about the structuralist principles of literary criticism. It's all about like science and looking to the future with a positive mindset, being optimistic. It's very, it's very Star Trek kind of an ideology, right? And so you have all these things that are meant to be futuristic, that are meant to look cool, and everything's looking up, and it's going to be great, right? But it also has this emphasis on science and like scientific findings to the exclusion of other conclusions of other epistemological levels, which I won't get too deeply into, but basically it's all about science, and it sort of pushes everything else to the sides. It's like, the important questions about like, what is the meaning of life, and what is the purpose of human beings, and all these types of like deeper questions, it just doesn't answer and doesn't think that they're worth answering because they can't be scientifically quantified. Now, that's interesting, right? There's something to that. It's asserting something positive. When you get into the postmodernist gallery, and postmodernism, like this is clear with postmodernism, but especially it becomes concrete when you walk into this gallery. It's all about tearing things down. It's saying, well, there were some problems with looking at everything purely scientifically that came with modernism, so we're just going to tear everything down. And their method of literary criticism was called post-structuralism, or more formally, deconstruction or deconstructionism, which is just like what it sounds. It just means tearing everything down and taking everything apart. And that kind of leaves you with nothing. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but basically everything in the postmodernist exhibit is, there's like somebody was hanging like almost like a meme on the wall, like one of those image macros. It wasn't quite that. There was a little bit more to it, but you could tell that it was something that looked like it would be like on a website, or, something that like would look like, it looks like a vaporwave album cover, basically, if you've ever seen those, where they're sort of like based on consumerism, but also like challenging consumerism. It's all about this sense of like making something that's deconstructing art, like where you look at it and you wonder, is this art? Like, is anything art? So that's the kind of things where you look at it and it's like a rectangle of solid color and there's like nothing to it. And you're like, well, that's not art, is it? Like that's the kind of thing that postmodern art is characterized by. But philosophically, when you move into that zone, you're tearing everything down. It's not a positive statement about anything. Postmodernism is just a negative statement. It's purely a negative ideology in many respects. It just tears everything down. And as you would expect, when you tear everything down, you're left with nothing, which is nihilism. Now, this is the thing that I really wanted to talk about, but really in the context of like moving forward in time to the present moment. So there's this one artist exhibit there, which was dedicated to exploring the Syrian refugee crisis. So, I was going to say if you're not familiar with that, but basically, like, everybody should be familiar with that by now. A bunch of people in Syria have a civil war going on, and they're immigrating places. Some people like that they're immigrating, some people don't. It's a thing, right? It's a thing that's happening. So when you go into this exhibit, there are all kinds of different things happening. There's like auditory things besides just the visual media of art. There's like speakers playing like people like screaming and freaking out and stuff. It's supposed to be very visceral because it's like, oh man, warfare, it's real bad, right? But then there's also a lot of sort of disturbing artwork and things like that. Like one of the pieces was just somebody cut off. I don't know if they were real human tongues or if they were like fabricated, because you can never tell with these sorts of things, and from my perspective anymore. But there was just tongues stuck on the wall. Like all kinds of weird sort of gross visceral stuff like that, right? Where it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess it's art, but like this is a little weird, right? And you could tell, though, you could still tell that it was meant to be, like, respectful to people who were, you know, going through a difficult time, right? Which is great, you know, good for you. But there was one thing in the center of the room, and it seemed like an afterthought because of what it was, and you'll understand this in a second, but it seemed a little bit disrespectful to me. So in the center of the room, it was just, like, where you would have with a statue, where you would rope it off. You would have the 4 posts around it, and then you'd have the ropes between them, and you have a sign saying like do not touch or something. You know, there was no sign for that here, but then there's the label for the artwork, and the label for an artwork usually has the title of the piece and the medium of it, and usually it says the author's name. But because this gallery was specifically dedicated to this one author, this one artist, it was just the title of the work and the medium. And I don't even remember what the title of the artwork was, but that's really inconsequential because it was nothing. There was nothing inside those ropes. It was just 4 ropes lined up in a square or a rectangular shape and just nothing. I looked up and down. There wasn't anything up on the ceiling, hanging down above it or anything, like something small that you couldn't tell. You couldn't immediately see. It was just the wooden floor and the air. That was it. There was nothing there. And the label there said that the medium of it was gallery, space, and time. So it's like, ooh, space and time, how deep. But it's like the artist didn't do anything. There's just nothing there, right? Which I thought was like, okay, I understand that maybe the person's intention was to say that there's, you know, that it seems like warfare makes everything meaningless, and that living through war or difficult or violent times, you know, makes everything appear meaningless. But I think it's probably more like this author, she didn't believe that there was meaning, right? Which is what nihilism is, essentially. Existentialism is like an offshoot of that, which means like, hey, there's no meaning, but like, at least I should make up my own meaning. I should live for whatever I think is important, right? Even though it's like subjective and it's not actually real. It's just like believing in something that's imaginary because you can't face the reality that there isn't anything. Which is, of course, contrary to like the traditional viewpoint that there's meaning to life that's objective, right? But not a lot of people would understand that upon immediately seeing it. Now, every artwork that exists involves an idea. It might not be that the idea was assigned to it by the author, it might not be that it was assigned after, it might be that it co-evolved with the work, but at any rate, every artwork has an idea associated with it, whether explicitly or implicitly, or whether it's assigned before, during, or after the work's creation. So if you look at modernism and postmodernism, obviously those works were guided very distinctly in most cases by a philosophy, beforehand, although they were also sometimes interpreted as being a part of that philosophy and that consequent art movement after the work was created. But in the case of this one, I think that a lot of people have not recognized in the mainstream art community that nihilism is sort of the objective and necessary conclusion to postmodernism, where, like, throughout history you've had this dialectic where different philosophies, like, one would rise and then another one would rise to challenge it and be like, no, you went too far in this direction, we're going to go back the other way. And then somebody else would come and react to that in the future and say, no, we need to pull it back the opposite direction. And there are all different kinds of dichotomies around this around which these would organize. And in the case of modernism and postmodernism, it was all about science and epistemology, but there are, of course, other flashpoints around which the debates of every era or time would take place. But I don't know if anything has ever really arisen that's like nihilism in this sense, and like a widespread level of being adopted. If you know anything about philosophy, you might associate nihilism with Friedrich Nietzsche, because he talked a lot about it, and he was kind of the guy who was a bit of a prophet in some sense, that he saw this coming, and he knew that even before postmodernism, he lived in a more modernist era, that this would lead ultimately to nihilism and to the destruction of meaning. So he talked about the Übermensch and having to create your own meaning in life. Basically, he was an existentialist in that sense, which I would consider to be a subset of nihilism. And so the reason why I think it's disrespectful is because it's not true and because it's harmful. So, like, when you talk about nihilism in the context of someone not believing that there's any meaning, especially a child, as this exhibit was centered around children who were affected by the Syrian civil war and by the immigration situation. I mean, to say that there's no meaning in the world to a child, and to say that that would be like a child's perspective, that seems like a little bit of a slap in the face and like a purposeful, not loss of innocence, but like deliberate killing of innocence. But hopefully the dialectic in the near future will start swinging back the opposite direction, and by some accounts it already has begun to swing back toward meaningfulness and sort of different kind of traditional perspective on meaning. And that would be great. But that's really all I wanted to say in this video. Just my trip to the art gallery, I guess. I know it's not about video games, but hey, I'll probably put this over gameplay. Okay guys, quick afterthought, look at how hyped this gameplay is. Like, this one, I'm gonna go all the way, I'm gonna get number 1. I'm just telling you right now. Like, I'm really bad at Fortnite, but I'm gonna make it this time out of sheer luck. I'm gonna get that supply drop, go straight down the hill, which is probably a terrible idea, because, like, the supply drop's gonna be super crowded with enemies, you know, I should be thinking, but I didn't even realize I was the second to last guy. I was, like, in the zone. I was all ready to go, and when I killed the guy, like, first of all, my aim is super bad. I barely even hit him, right? It's super bad. But when I finally finished the game, I was like, oh, first place, what a surprise. So that was pleasant. Like, even if you don't care about, like, philosophy or whatever junk I was talking about in this video on art and culture, like, that was pretty hype, you gotta admit. It was worth the wait. So I'm not gonna tell you to smash that like button, but hey man, like, if that's what you want to do, I'm not gonna stop you, you know. I'm just saying, just pointing out that, you know, it's something you could do. I'm not telling you to, but, like, you know, I mean, you could if you want. You could even click that subscribe button if you want. I'm not telling you have to, like, it's your life, man. I'm just telling you, like, you could, you know, if you feel like it. But anyway, see you later.